but I want to thank all of you who are giving up your time this evening to participate in this presentation. And I also want to thank Bob Emerson, the Executive Director of Old Fort Niagara, for making the Zoom presentation possible. Now, go back to your history books back in grade school or high school, and if you learned anything about the War of 1812, you learned about the burning of the White House, the Francis Scott Key and the Star-Spangled Banner, and Andrew Jackson winning the Battle of New Orleans after the war was over. I'm going to talk to you more about New York's central position in the War of 1812 that's pretty much been ignored by many of the history books. Okay, why did I write this book? Well, the story of New York's vital participation in the war has not been told in its particulars. The scholarship on the battles and some of the activities in and around New York is just excellent. Don Graves, John Schroeder, Robert Malcolmson, a number of historians have done some really good work on picking apart the battles and the campaigns. But no previous work has integrated all of the battlefield and naval activity and talked about how state and federal politics work together or against one another, nor have they integrated what was going on in New York society, and I attempt to do that. Also, the battle studies tended to concentrate on the federal troops in the battle and minimize the role of militia participation that might have been in the battle or might have been in the environs of the battle. But there's a more visceral reason why I wanted to write this book. That's because when the bicentennial rolled around, Maryland grabbed ownership of the War of 1812. I love that license plate, War of 1812. You can still see some of these. Governor Martin O'Malley had a whole closet full of uniforms and period dress, and he put them on in a moment, and he would go off to the various bicentennial commemorations in persona, and he delivered a keynote speech at a conference that I was invited to in Annapolis, for example. But kind of what really got me is this War of 1812 DVD. The War of 1812 on the Chesapeake, subtitled Home of the Brave. And I ask you, how many DVDs are covering the War of 1812 in New York State? Some cover some small aspect of it, but there's none that cover the sweep of the war as Maryland's DVD did. Okay, some of the subjects that I covered in the book are these. First, I want to talk about the activities and the contributions of the state government and the militia. I want to talk about the participation of the Iroquois Nation. I write about commerce, smuggling, privateering, the party politics, and the significant anti-war movement. And importantly, because it has not been done much, I want to talk to the federal and state cooperation in war making. Now, this is in the Constitution. When the nation makes war, they depend upon the states, certainly for resourcing. And this was America's first foreign war. And therefore, they are taking steps to see how the federal government can operate with the state government of New York and the other 16 state governments. Now, I do talk to battles and engagements around the state. I'm not going into the depth that you would see, for example, in any of the scholarly studies of battles and campaigns. What I do that is absent elsewhere is I speak to New York's participation, the people and the state government in those battles and campaigns, something that is missing elsewhere. Now, finally, I try to talk to the anecdotes and the stories that have been largely buried in history. I resurrect some stories that haven't appeared in print in well over a century. So we'll revisit what the participants, civilians and military, did during the war. Now, I divide the story geographically and chronologically. You can see the chronological laydown here. The geographic is this. I've divided the state into 4 regions, and I discuss in chapters on the region what's happening there and how it affects the rest of the war, and what's happening between what's going on in that region and what's happening in Albany, the state capital. The four regions I divide the state in are these. First, the Niagara frontier, pretty well self-explanatory. The second I call the North Country. But here the North Country isn't just Sackett's Harbor and Ogdensburg. It is the entire south coast of Lake Ontario, because the Naval War and the Land War came together across the stretch from the mouth of the Niagara right up to Ogdensburg on the St. Lawrence. The third region is the Lake Champlain region. Lake Champlain lies along the traditional north-south invasion route that connects New York City with Montreal. And finally, I treat New York City in each of the groups of chapters because so much is going on there. No battles, but the amount of resources that the federal and state government poured into New York City was really tremendous. Now, the demographics in 1812, the total population of the United States is over 7 million. New York State has 13% of the national population, is now the largest state. New York City has about 10% of the state's population. It's the largest city in the nation, Philadelphia being second and Baltimore third. And in that chapter, I talk about the first nickname of New York City, which was Gotham. And in Old English, Gotham is translated, it means homestead where goats are kept. Don't know how appropriate that was, but you will read where Gotham came from. Now, for the nation, the countdown for the war started with the Chesapeake affair in 1807. But for New York, it started a year earlier. His Majesty's ship Leander was off of New York Harbor. It was stopping every merchant ship entering or leaving New York's harbor, and it would fire a cannon across the bow of a merchant ship to grab its attention and to make it stop. Well, one of these shots was aimed at a merchant sloop, and it took the head off of the helmsman, who was a New York City resident. And when word got back to New York City that this helmsman had been killed in a routine stop, the city went crazy. The protests, the riots, and the people held a very public funeral for this individual. Now, the hue and cry was great in New York City, but it didn't spread through the rest of the country. The following year, with the Chesapeake affair, the whole nation was crying out for war, a cry that President Jefferson chose to ignore for the time. One of the central personages of the war is the governor of New York State, Daniel Tompkins. He's buried in history. Unfortunately, I try to resurrect him. He was the governor during the entirety of the war, and he went on to be vice president of the United States for 8 years. Now, the interesting thing about Tompkins, now he's a Republican. He's following Jefferson's party. This is not the Republican Party of today. These folks are now called Democratic Republicans, but they call themselves Republicans, not Democrats. He was the first governor of New York State who was not from the landed gentry. He had common beginnings. He was his dad was a farmer. After he graduated from Columbia, he got a law degree, entered politics pretty early. People saw his worth and they put him up for governor, and he was elected the first time he ran. Now, in 1812, Madison has war aims. There are things that have been bothering America for years, and he wanted to declare war, and he got Congress to do that for these three war aims. First, to persuade Britain to respect neutral shipping rights. Second, to stop Britain from impressing American sailors. And third, to stop Britain from inciting the Indians on the frontier. Now, Madison and Congress knew that Britain was caught in an existential conflict with France, and they had been so for about 10 years by now. And therefore, Madison thought that if he could seize Canada quickly, he could trade Canada back for those three concessions. And if Britain refused to negotiate on those three concessions, then the United States would retain Canada. In those days, seizing Canada meant seizing Montreal, which would cut off the supply line to the interior, and if possible, also seizing Quebec. And additionally, Madison would launch hundreds of privateers to attack the British merchant marine to provide an additional irritant and motivation to Britain to come to the negotiating table. Now, the New York Militia in 1812 was a massive organization, 159 infantry regiments, 9 cav regiments, and the equivalent of 5 regiments of artillery. This organization, this pool of manpower, was larger than the entire regular army at any time during the war. Daniel Tompkins was the commander-in-chief of the militia, and as such, he could control the entire thing, give them orders, order them into any place, except he could not order them outside of the territory of the United States. That's a constitutional protection for the militia. Another personage important is Peter Buell Porter. Porter's got a house in Black Rock, so he's a resident of the Niagara frontier. He was sent to Congress, a Republican. He's a war hawk. He talked up the war. Now, interestingly enough, Porter was not present when the vote for war was taken in the House. He was in Albany. The governor appointed him to be New York State's quartermaster general. So as a brigadier general, he now is responsible for arming and supplying, feeding, and transporting the militia organization when it is brought into active duty. The first big battle I talk about is Queenston Heights, and I'm not going to go over the battle now, but at Queenston Heights, the defeat of the American forces is ascribed to the fact that thousands of New York State militiamen failed to cross the river. They didn't have to. It was their constitutional right to remain in New York, but the defeat is ascribed to them. Over 3,000 of them. So I look at various reasons, and there are many reasons why they didn't cross, but I've isolated a few at the bottom here. Why didn't they cross? Was it leadership, training, morale, fear of death, fear of going to a prisoner of war camp? How strong was the anti-war sentiment at the time? Was political partisanship an issue? And there's also the very real animosity between regular forces and militia forces. Now, I carry these metrics forward when I analyze the other battles and campaigns throughout the war, so I return to that list from time to time. After the defeat at Queenston Heights, there is a national election. Madison is running for re-election against DeWitt Clinton. The interesting thing here is both candidates are Republicans. DeWitt Clinton, however, represents the anti-war wing of the Republican Party, and therefore he garners an awful lot of Federalist votes. But the difference in the electoral vote shown here is not as close as the popular vote. Some states, a popular vote selected the electors. Other states, the electors were selected by the state legislatures. But in the popular vote, DeWitt Clinton and Madison are only separated by 5 percentage points. So it doesn't give Madison a mandate to continue the war. What it really does is demonstrate the strength of an anti-war movement. A few months later, Daniel Tompkins is running for his third term as governor, and he runs against Stephen Van Rensselaer, who commanded the troops. He's a Federalist who commanded the troops at Queenston Heights, and unfortunately gets the credit for losing the battle. Now, Van Rensselaer is the richest man in New York at the time. He is so rich that even today, he is within the top 15 richest Americans of all time. And you see the vote there, how close it is, within 4 percentage points. And one of the reasons that the experts say that Van Rensselaer lost the election was that the voter fraud in the state favored the Republicans. Now, Van Rensselaer didn't claim that the election was stolen from him, at least not in public. Again, it reflects the weight of the anti-war movement in the state. Now, here's a map of New York City and 2 individuals, engineers, who are going to be building the fortifications there. New York City had been occupied by the British during the Revolutionary War, and it was not a pleasant occupation. As a matter of fact, during the war, upwards on a third of the city was burned to the ground, and the buildings there were not, it was not rebuilt until after the British evacuated New York City. And this was in the memory of many of the people in the city when the war is declared. And therefore, there's a feeling in New York City that they're never going to be occupied again. And therefore, a lot of resources, federal and state and city resources, are put in the building of fortifications that will close off Long Island Sound and the Narrows, the Upper Bay, from British warships. A couple of these still exist. We've got Castle Williams on Governor's Island, and we have Castle Clinton at Battery Park. Now, the interesting thing about Castle Clinton on Battery Park is that during the war, it was sitting on an artificial island jutting out from the southern end of Manhattan. So all the area, Battery Park today has been built up over the years, but at the time of the war, that fortification there was surrounded by water. Okay, let's move on to May of 1813. And here we have the assault on Fort George, right across the river, about 1,000 yards from Fort Niagara. What I talk about at Fort George is the tremendously successful cooperation of the Lake Ontario Squadron out of Sackett's Harbor and the Army. The Navy landed the Army nearly flawlessly. The Army quickly took Fort George, and the British evacuated the entire western side of the Niagara River, opening up the Niagara to the Americans. But while that was going on, while the Lake Ontario Squadron was off of Fort George, the Royal Navy Squadron out of Kingston raided Sackett's Harbor in an attempt to burn down the warehouses full of naval supplies and possibly either capture or burn the General Pike, a frigate being built there in the harbor. They land at Horse Island. They get all the way up to Fort Tompkins. They come within about 100 yards of the warehouses and the workshops when the British commander calls off the attack. However, the naval commander in charge, left in charge at Sackett's Harbor, gives the order to burn the General Pike and the various warehouses. And when they find out that the British have left, they have to put out the fires. Too late, a lot of the equipment, the sails and cables for the General Pike have been destroyed. So it delays the shipbuilding effort on Lake Ontario. Now, at the end of 1813, I focus a whole chapter on the destruction of the Niagara frontier. Here we have the British coming down the road to assault Buffalo. What you see here, the image here, is what's left of Buffalo after the wood is burned down to the foundation, and all that's left are the chimneys. And on the left, you see the number of houses, barns, stores, shops that were burned down. History records that only one house remained, and that was in Buffalo. But I want to point out here is that the state immediately jumped in with grants and loans to the people to rebuild. Now, during the 12 days in which the destruction of the Niagara frontier occurred, upwards on 6,000 New Yorkers from Niagara County departed inland because they feared that the native warriors who came with the British were right on their heels to scalp them. And there was scalping and killing of civilians during these 12 days. Most of these people returned, but not all of them. And they went inland in the winter, in December, many of them with just the clothes on their back. The federal government came in after the war and backfilled New York's efforts. They paid even more claims, and they backpaid New York eventually for the money that it had loaned and granted over the destruction. Now, I might point out here there was a lot of destruction in the Chesapeake, perhaps even more than is on the Niagara frontier, but that destruction occurred over a year and a half period, not a compressed 12-day period. So I would match the destruction on the Niagara with that on the Chesapeake any day. Now, in 1814, something pretty darn horrible happens for the United States. Napoleon is defeated. What this means is that the war in Europe is over. Hundreds of British warships no longer have to blockade Europe. Tens of thousands of British soldiers, trained, experienced, are shipped over to North America to pursue a war of vengeance. The British public was ranting to punish America because America had stabbed Britain in the back while Britain was fighting the ogre Napoleon for the benefit of all mankind. And so America had done something dastardly and they needed to be punished. Now, America is reading all of this in the newspapers that are coming back from Europe. So Americans know exactly what they can expect. So how did this appear to the Americans? They were in great trepidation for counterattacks that could happen anywhere because the Royal Navy could deposit large numbers of British troops anywhere along the Atlantic or Gulf coasts. Vice Admiral Sir Alexander Cochrane is in command of the Royal Navy in the Western Atlantic. He's going to be landing those invasion forces, and he writes this: I have it much at heart to give them a complete drubbing before peace is made, when I trust their northern limits will be circumscribed and the command of the Mississippi wrested from them. The negotiations would open up in Ghent, in the country that is now Belgium. It wasn't Belgium at the time, in August. And the British presented some very serious draconian demands. They demanded the creation of an Indian buffer state. Now, this was a sine qua non, which means if America doesn't create this buffer state, then there will be no treaty, and the war will continue, and America will continue to be punished. This Indian buffer state is described geographically as everything north of the Ohio River. Now, what's north of the Ohio? Well, the state of Ohio is, but also the Illinois, Indiana, Michigan territories, and even additional lands. That would be administered by Britain, not the United States. In addition, no U.S. naval forces would be allowed on the Great Lakes, nor would any fortifications be allowed on the shores of the Great Lakes. So this is pretty fierce. The American diplomats rejected it, and negotiations bogged down. Now, before that occurred, but with the troops arriving in Canada, the Royal Navy makes an attack on Oswego in May. Oswego is important for this reason. The supply line that leads from New York up the Hudson to Albany then uses a water route to supply everybody on the St. Lawrence and Lake Ontario and the Niagara frontier. So river vessels come down to Oswego. From there, the cargoes are transloaded onto lake vessels, and they go east or west to drop off the supplies. The British raid captures Fort Ontario. The British just outnumbered the U.S. defenders. And they capture a bunch of the warehouses, and they capture a bunch of food. Fortunately for the Americans, the vast bulk of war material at the time was upriver at Oswego Falls, so it was not captured. So the Battle of Oswego, even though it's considered a mixed success for the British, they didn't accomplish what they wanted to do. Now, when the Empire strikes back in full force and fury, in August, there's the Battle of Bladensburg. The British roll over an army, mostly of militiamen, and they burn Washington, the public buildings in the city of Washington, and some civilian buildings as well. And they occupy 100 miles of the coast of Maine, and it's pretty well understood that after the war, the part of northern Maine would revert to British North America. Now, what I call the miracle of the 7 days in September are three events that occur in a 7-day period. we have the Battle of Plattsburgh, we have the defense of Baltimore, Fort McHenry, and we have the breakout of the left division from Fort Erie. Two of these events occur in or across the river from New York State, and all three of them will affect how the negotiations play out. We'll cover that in a moment. First, let's look at the Battle of Plattsburgh. Very quickly here, the U.S. Naval Squadron under McDonough destroys the British squadron. Meanwhile, 9,000 British troops in Plattsburgh, a large force of them cross the Saranac and are going to attempt to destroy the American garrison. The American garrison there is represented by those three black squares. Those are redoubts built on that peninsula. The American army is in those redoubts or just north of them. The Americans under Alexander Macomb, also a New Yorker, are surrounded. There's no way out. There are no operable bridges across the Saranac River. There aren't enough boats to evacuate the army. And Macomb is determined to defend, even though he's outnumbered about 3-1. Now, when the British commander realizes that he's lost the Royal Navy squadron, he stops the campaign. He calls off the land attack, and the British Army marches back to Montreal, and Plattsburgh and Lake Champlain at that point there is freed of Royal Navy vessels and is safe for at least until 1815, or when the British can rebuild a squadron. Let's go to the left division, about 2,000 regulars who are holed up in Fort Erie right across the river from Buffalo. General Jacob Brown, a New Yorker, Major General, is in charge of the left division in Fort Erie. The British have 3 batteries just shelling the fort. There are casualties every day. Brown wants to break out. He wants to break the siege by sortying out of the fort. He doesn't have the manpower. He sends General Porter to rally the New York militia and convince them, the Battle of Queenston Heights notwithstanding, to convince them to cross the river and reinforce the garrison. So he assembles about 3,000 New York militiamen in downtown Buffalo. It is a rainy day. Porter gives just apparently a marvelous speech telling the New Yorkers that there are 2,000 Americans across the river who they themselves have no means of escape. There aren't enough boats to evacuate the garrison from Fort Erie, and there's essentially no way out if the British can get into the fort. 2,200 New Yorkers agreed to cross the river immediately following that speech. They marched down to the river, and the boats shuttled them across the river. Now, here you see Fort Erie and the American camp south of Fort Erie. And about a week later, Brown is going to launch his attack. A lot of detail on the right of the various assaults. General Porter leads the main assault through the woods, and he's going to erupt upon the British batteries, numbered 1, 2, and 3. He's going to erupt upon them by surprise. It's in a drizzle. A lot of the gunpowder won't fire. This battle is at very close quarters, hand-to-hand in some instances, and roughly half the attackers are New York militiamen, and the rest are regulars and volunteers. And the militiamen redeem their reputation. In this fight, they take on British regulars. Now, I'm not saying the militia is equivalent to the regulars. I could not say that. Nonetheless, they press this attack through Battery 3, Battery 2, and onto Battery 1 when the British counterattacking force hits them hard, and General Brown gives the direction to do a fighting withdrawal back into Fort Erie. Now, the British commander had already made the decision to break off the siege for a number of reasons, but no one in the trenches had done anything yet. So over the next couple of days, as the British pull out of their siege positions, the thought in the American camp was that this sortie had forced the British to break off the siege. But in effect, what has happened here is a very large American force is left in Canada. The British have not been able to eject them and won't do that. It won't be until November when the Americans on their own voluntarily withdraw back to Buffalo. Now, back to London. The ministry wants a new commander in North America. They offer the command to the Iron Duke, Sir Arthur Wellesley. Now, Duke Wellington is the British ambassador in Paris at the time. Frankly, he doesn't want to go to America. But he analyzes what's going on in the war in North America, and he writes this to the ministry. That which appears to me to be lacking in America is not a general, but naval superiority on the lakes. He's talking specifically about Lake Erie, Lake Ontario, and Lake Champlain. The question is whether we can acquire this naval superiority on the lakes. If we can't, I shall do you but little good in America, and I shall go there only to sign a peace which might as well be signed now. Now, then he talks to the ministry, he writes to the ministry about whether the ministry can demand any territory, this Indian buffer state. And he writes this: I think you have no right from the state of war to demand any concession of territory from America. You have not been able to carry it, the war, into the enemy's territory, and have not even cleared your own territory of enemy forces. Now, he's referring to the forces left over at Fort Erie. You cannot, on any principle of equality in negotiation, claim a cession of territory. This goes to London. The ministry considers it. They figure that Wellington is correct. They issue a new set of negotiating terms, demands to the negotiating team in Ghent. They drop all demands for territory. They sign the peace treaty on Christmas Eve. The Americans sign that treaty fast so that before the British can change their mind. The treaty goes to Parliament, which approves it. It gets on a boat heading to Washington, D.C., where the Senate will ratify the treaty in February, and President Madison will declare it into law the following day, and that officially ends the War of 1812. Now, here are some of the things you're going to find in the book that you may not find anywhere else. This is a collection of these are the battles that occurred within the boundary of New York State. And also there's other campaigns outside the state that originated in New York. But these are the ones in the state, a significant list here. And we speak to all of them. And this is, again, where I resurrect some stories that have been lost to history. Some of these places had more than one fight during the course of the war. And this is a partial list of the New Yorkers who are covered in the book, a little bit about their background, what they did during the war, and in some cases, what happened to them after the war, and a considerable list here. So there's military, civilian, Iroquois. I want to point out in dead center, Henry Leavenworth, born in Connecticut, moves to Delaware County, is a lawyer, gets and a militia officer, gets himself a commission as a captain in the Army, and I bring him up. He's one of my personal heroes. I'm giving this speech from Leavenworth, Kansas, named after Henry Leavenworth, because Henry came out here and founded Fort Leavenworth right outside the city of Leavenworth, and he's buried in the National Cemetery on Fort Leavenworth. Now, let's talk about the privateering for just a moment. There are 246 successful privateers launched from the United States. 44 of these came out of New York City. These 44 made a total of 401 captures of British or Canadian merchant vessels. 9 of those privateers captured 20 or more vessels. 6. Those 6 captured a total of 172. The winner in the privateer championship is the Saratoga, which has a total of 32 captures. And now we start the quiz section of this presentation. Who is this man? Well, in the first quiz, I'm going to give you the answer. This is Hiram Cronk. He's the last surviving soldier of the War of 1812. At the age of 14, he served 3 months at Saga's Harbor. And he was the last pensioner paid off the last survivor of the war, dying in 1905. Now, James Fenimore Cooper, you know him, you've read some of his novels. He actually wrote about the War of 1812, and I'm going to give you the hint about what he wrote about. The entire story's in the book. The hint is this. This is the schooner Scourge. It's lying at the bottom of Lake Ontario, discovered in the 1980s. And there's your hint. What we know about the Scourge, we know from James Fenimore Cooper. Washington Irving, literary giant even before the war. Other than President Madison and George Washington, he's probably the most widely known American. He and his family are Federalists. His family are merchants in New York City, and merchants were suffering during the war. Nonetheless, during the crisis of 1814, while the citizens of New York City are waiting for the Royal Navy to show up at any moment to do what they did during the American Revolution and what they had just done to Baltimore, while they are at that moment of crisis, Washington Irving shows up at Daniel Tompkins' headquarters, and he offers his services. Now, what Governor Tompkins does is something that still kind of surprises me. He takes Irving, who has no military experience whatsoever, and makes him a colonel, and makes him the aide to the governor. And he sends him on a mission to Sackett's Harbor, and he gives him the full power of the commander-in-chief of the New York Militia to raise whatever militia units he needs to raise to defend Sackett's Harbor. He has another connection with the War of 1812, and here's your clue. Now, I scanned through the people that are watching this video, and most of you are of a mature age, and therefore I think you are very familiar with the name of this gentleman here from this photograph. You know his name, and I would ask, who is he? And just because you'll think badly of me, because I won't tell you right here, right now, his name is Ichabod Crane. And Ichabod Crane, obviously, is a character, and this is, and I explained the connection of how Washington Irving made this connection and used this name in his literature. Robert Fulton. We know him from the history books because he built the Claremont, which is the first commercially successful steamboat up and down the Hudson River even before the war. But he has a much deeper contribution to the war effort in the defense of New York City. And the hint to that is the seascape that appears immediately to the left of Fulton there. You see a ship exploding. And I go into some great depth in the book to explain how Robert Fulton came about making this contribution to the war effort, the defense of New York City. Now let's talk about that Canadian Laura Secord. She is a true heroine in Canada. She has at least 2 full-size bronze statues of her, one at Niagara Falls, one in Ottawa. During the bicentennial, the Canadian government issued a stamp with her on it, very youthful lady, and she has a whole line of chocolates. That company is more than a century old. So good on her, good on Laura Secord. Here's what we have. We have our own Betsy Doyle. She's our Molly Pitcher. You know the story of her manning the guns in November 1812, the 6-pounder atop the South Redoubt. What you may not know is what she did additionally to contribute to the war effort. In 1813 December, when the British capture the Fort Niagara, the day before she is in Fort Niagara, the American militia there in Fort Niagara know that they're going to be attacked. They are fearful. What Betsy does is she dons a guard overcoat, she straps on a cartridge box, she grabs a musket, and in the cold and in the rain, she stands guard that night to shame the other militiamen in doing their duty. Now, the following day, she's at her home at Youngstown. When the British actually attack, she grabs her children. She walks hundreds of miles across the state, ending up at Greenbush outside of Albany, which is a major American cantonment. And there she volunteers her service to act as a nurse in the hospital. Now, her husband, Andrew, has been captured back at the Battle of Queenston Heights. She doesn't know where he is or his story, and the two of them will never be reunited, even at the end of the war. Now, Kate Emerson has brought that story to us. She's corrected the historical record. She's written articles and other things. So now we know a lot about her. So my question that I pose every opportunity I get, and I will to this audience tonight, and I do in the book, is why can't we elevate Betsy Doyle's reputation, if you will, at least to the height of Laura Secord? Where's her postage stamp? Also, where is the painting of a realistic painting of what happened atop the South Redoubt when Betsy was hauling up the hotshot to load that, to serve the gun and load that 6-pounder? Maybe she doesn't get a life-size bronze statue, but certainly a painting, a postage stamp, and a coloring book, children's books. Those kinds of things are probably worthwhile to bring the legacy of this woman, who really was a hero at a time where women didn't do these sorts of things. Maybe we need to take that into our thoughts and maybe push some endeavors in that regard. So, what are the results of the war? Well, certainly Britain and much of Europe are a little less contemptuous of the United States. Remember, the United States is a republic, and that's a dirty word in Europe. There's also a new awakening of American nationhood, born of pride and confidence, because remember, the Americans believe they won the war because they won the Battle of New Orleans. All right. But that pride and confidence was infused in New Yorkers. New York City was not invaded, and New York then focused its efforts on building the Erie Canal. Now, we're going to ask for your questions in a moment, and I hope that most of you, some of you, many of you, are not resembling this student here who just received his lecture on the War of 1812. Now, this is how you get my book. This is the website to go to, and a reminder that Old Fort Niagara is offering a 10% discount on book sales. Now, having said all of that, we are now open for questions.
Unmute yourself. So we'll start with Louis Buttery.
Hi, nice to meet you. Excellent presentation. Any mention of Gad Pierce with his Pierce's brigade during the summer of 1812 when war was declared, and then in 1813 with the burning of the frontier, he defended his tavern / blockhouse and prevented the British from, well, helped prevent the British from getting to Buffalo that day, and they had to go back across the river and finally get to Buffalo a few days later. So he played a big role there in the Niagara frontier during this war. So I'm just wondering if you mentioned him at all, or, you know.
Right. I emphasize the militia and the civilians in that in the whole chapter on the burning of the Niagara frontier, and I resurrect as many stories as I've been able to find.
Okay. The reason I ask is he's an ancestral uncle of mine. Also about the Mud Ball War of 1810.
I don't have that. I'm sorry.
Oh. Some young boys got inspired by probably the Chesapeake Affair. So the British started sailing a ship up the river, and they had already built some cannon out of logs, and they fired mud balls at the ships and basically annoyed the British, and they came stomping over and demanded the boys be punished and all that.
Great story. I was unaware of that.
Okay.
Now let me remind you, my publisher put a hard limit on the number of words that I could put in this book. And I cut over 15,000 words to boil it down to what you will read.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Deborah Carey next. Go ahead and unmute yourself.
You unmuted, Deb? You hear me? You there?
Right.
Okay, let's go back to the very beginning of your book, your lecture here. We learned in school, I think, that what you said, the British were kind of, messing with American shipping. Okay, why? Were they just ready to piss us off? I mean, why were they doing it to begin with?
Long story, but it is that war that they are conducting against Napoleonic France. They want no war material, no food, eventually no cargoes whatsoever to enter into French ports. And as France expanded to control almost all the ports around Europe, the British would allow no shipping in. So if that makes any sense to you, they wanted to reserve all the trade for themselves. And this violated the American understanding of neutral shipping rights. Neutral nations should be able to trade freely. Now, they can't go through blockades, but if they can get into a port, the Americans believe they should have been able to trade. The British would not accept that. They were at war. If you can imagine Britain's determination to fight Nazi Germany, that is replicated in their determination to destroy Napoleon and the French Republic.
Jim Coey, go ahead.
Sir, are you aware that you talked a little bit about the Duke of Wellington? And I read your statement. I was glad to read it. Are you aware, sir, that he earlier had sent his brother-in-law to New Orleans?
Right.
Yeah, it's his brother-in-law's General Packingham. And the question
Yes, good.
I was always curious, if he really thinks it's a loser, then why does he send his brother-in-law to get whacked on the field in New Orleans? And I'm actually a volunteer at the Chalmette National Battlefield, where we sit every day and wonder, why?
Let me tell you a story about General Packenham that you probably know, but maybe the rest of the audience doesn't. Packenham gets killed by American riflemen at the Battle of New Orleans. Falls down from his horse. He's dead by the time he hits the ground. The British recover the body. Now, for the most part, Britain buries its dead where they die. They don't evacuate bodies. But for a general officer or senior officers, they will return them to Britain. So they take Packenham's body, they put it in a barrel, fill the barrel with rum to preserve his body, and they ship the barrel back to Britain. Well, a bunch of Royal Navy sailors discover this barrel of rum in the hold of the ship, and they tap it. So they're drinking the rum down, and this is not discovered until they open up the barrel to prepare his body for a funeral, for burial. So you can say this about Packenham. He may not have been a great general. He lost the battle. But one thing we know about him for sure is that he returned to Europe in good spirits.
Yeah, that's, I actually talk to people who come to visit every day, and I'm going to tell them that starting tomorrow.
Very good.
Actually is alive. He's taken to the hospital at Delaron Plantation and dies there. But about everybody who participated in the Battle of New Orleans claimed they whacked Packenham. And it's kind of that, Andy Griffith show, where everybody won the Battle of Mayberry. That actually didn't happen. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Here's another question for you. Can you further explain the relationship between Canadians and New Yorkers before and during the war?
Sure. Upwards on 1/3 of Canadian civilians had moved to Canada because of land grants, and they took an oath of allegiance to the crown to get cheap land. So many of these people, either born in the United States or children of people born in the United States, were not fiercely in favor of British control. They were either neutral or maybe even preferred to belong to the United States of America. Then you have the Loyalists who came immediately after the Revolution, many of them from New York City, who were allowed to move into Upper Canada, Ontario. And so there was this friction within the Upper Canada civilian from the old-time Loyalists and these newcomers. And many people, and you probably know this, in 1812, a lot of the Canadian citizens just accepted that America was going to do what it said it was going to do. It was going to march into Montreal and take over the country. And so a lot of them remained neutral. Some of them actually renegades, Canadians who joined the Canadian Volunteers, for example. So as far as, and their relationship with New Yorkers, of course, especially across the St. Lawrence River, and is one of trade, it's one of commerce. Canadians have European manufactured goods that they're willing to sell in America, and the Americans have any number of products, potash, lumber, and whatnot, that they are happy, more than happy, to sell to the citizens of Upper Canada. So smuggling is just rampant, to include during the war, especially in the Lake Champlain area. I think I saw a question from Paul Lear, and then the question disappeared, so I'd like to read it to everybody if I could see it again. Do I need to go to chat to do this? Okay. I'm not finding Paul's question. There's Paul. Okay, Paul asks, do you plan to follow up on your Betsy Doyle Man in the Moon candies in Oswego? Sure. I will design or I'll find a designer, and I will certainly purchase, and I will buy a share in your family's business. Thank you, Paul.
Craig Bacon has a question. Considering
Yes, Craig.
you can read it there.
Considering British focus on Napoleon, would a decisive American victory at the Battle of Queenston Heights maybe have soured the British on continuing the war in North America? I don't think so, because I think Queenston Heights, even had the Americans won, would have been a strategic dead end. I think the only thing that would have grabbed British attention would be a successful attack on Kingston, the naval facility, or on Montreal itself. I think they were willing to give up much of Western Upper Canada and perhaps the Niagara Peninsula, and still remained in the war, because once the war with Napoleon is over, they know they can come back and regain everything that they lost, because the New York Militia aren't going to stay garrisoning Upper Canada for more than their 90 days of service, if that answers your question. And I'm looking to see who. Robert Mullen asked, can you explain the close relationship Maine had with Canada? There's the intercoastal trade straight up with New Brunswick. I'm aware of that. I'm not entirely sure what else was going on. There was that commercial trade which tied in New Brunswick and Nova Scotia, as well as Maine, if that answers your question.
David Caldwell has a question. David, can you unmute yourself?
Yes, I can. Thanks, Aaron. Rich, as always, wonderful presentation.
Thank you, David.
I just want to I haven't quite finished the book yet. I just picked it up the other day, but from what I've read, you filled a tremendous hole in the education on the War of 1812. You need to send a copy to Ralph Eshelman. But I was not aware of the extent that they defended New York City. That was very interesting to read about.
Okay, very good.
Congratulations and good presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Richard, there was also a question about spy networks along the border. Do you have any information on that?
Spying is an area that someone needs to write a thesis or even a dissertation on. There are hundreds of references to spies, but other than identifying a handful of folks who probably were sharing information, there's not much hard evidence, if you will. I mean, when you're writing a letter about a spy, you're not calling him by name. You might be tracing where he went and what he said, but that doesn't identify him. So I have some of that certainly in the book. There are spies, particularly at Sackett's Harbor and Kingston, and certainly back and forth the St. Lawrence, Ogdensburg, and whatnot. But other than that, I don't go deep into it because I don't think anyone can go too deep into it.
So essentially, they did a good job spying.
I didn't catch that.
I said, so essentially, they did a good job spying.
Right. Well, you read the letter of what the spy says for example, on the British side, Mr. X reports A, B, C, and D. Well, you know that A, B, and C and D are only partially true. So how effective the spying is, I don't know. They're reporting on numbers of troops, numbers of vessels, and how close that vessel is to sailing. But a lot of the data that they're passing is only a partial truth.
Phil Russell has a question. If you can go ahead and unmute yourself.
Yes, Rich, what a great presentation. Very interested in the War of 1812, and my favorite place in all of this area is Fort Niagara. Now, I have some native friends who are with the Tuscaroras, and a couple of things they have said. Number one, they do not like the term Iroquois presented, and I understand why their thoughts are, and also they said that scalping was not their thing, but a French thing. Now, what is your take on it?
I could have said Haudenosaunee, but had I did, I think I'd lose a lot of my readers. I think most of the readers of the War of 1812 readily identify Iroquois and the Confederation. As far as the scalping is concerned, that goes back to Columbus, doesn't it? I mean, there's a history of scalping so deep into the connection between Europeans and Native Americans and First Peoples. Scalping was proof that you, instead of carrying a body or a prisoner, it's proof that you took a casualty. And there is certainly purchasing scalps that occurs right up through the American Revolution. Peter Porter, when offered scalps after the Battle of Chippewa, utterly refuses to accept them. So the Seneca, who were fighting, hundreds of them, fighting on the American side at Chippewa, then destroyed the scalps or threw them into the Niagara River. They were frustrated that they weren't collecting a bounty for killing Canadian militiamen and First Peoples who were fighting in the forest off to the west of the battlefield. Well, they were in the battlefield, excuse me. The forest was a battlefield.
David Woodruff, he has a question. Are you going to follow up on the story with the famous Jacob Brown cattle story?
No, I'm not. I don't know enough about that. If you know, please eliminate the audience here. I don't know enough to recite that tonight.
Did Peter Porter profit from the war through his forwarding company?
Probably. I don't have the numbers. Probably yes.
We have a
Remember
couple,
for the
just one or two more questions if we could. Where did the militia serve? Oh, we already did one. Never mind. I think we're good. Any other questions, Dan? Well, I'd like at this point, I think, to introduce Rob Emerson, the Executive Director of Old Fort Niagara. Rob, take it away.
Good evening, everyone, and thanks for attending tonight. Just a plug for our next event coming up, which is on February 6th. It's a special tour called The Hidden African American History of Fort Niagara, and it includes a stint here by the 24th Infantry Regiment in 1909. They've been made famous lately by a film about their involvement in some bad stuff in Houston in 1917, but most people don't know that they were here at Fort Niagara in the summer of 1909. So go to our website if you want more information on that special tour. It's going to cover the role of African Americans here at the fort from the 18th through the 20th centuries. Other than that, we're scheduling events for this year, for the rest of the year, and you can look those up on our website. With the understanding that they may get canceled. We don't know at this point. The situation is still pretty fluid. So just check in frequently. We'll be updating the website and giving current information on what's going on.
And that brings an end to this presentation this evening. Thank you all for showing up. We hope you had a great time. Any questions that weren't answered in the chat, we'll make sure that Richard gets a copy of them. And if you leave your contact information, which we have on registration, I believe, we'll be able to get them answered for you. Again, thank you very much for showing up. We will be putting this on the Fort's YouTube channel for all those that want to revisit it. And again, we hope you had a great time, and we hope you appreciate the effort of Richard, his great book. We hope you buy the book. That would be good. Net proceeds will go to help the fort, and who doesn't want to do that? In any event, thank you very much for this evening. We'll bring you some other presentation in the near future. Follow our Facebook page at facebook.com/Old Fort Niagara. And again, good night.